What if I told you almost every behavioral interview video was letting you down for one reason? There's no formula. There's no system for how to actually answer questions. And that's the biggest missing piece of the puzzle. Yeah, we know to use the STAR method. We're really setting it up with some sort of problem, situation, task. We got to get into our actions and talk about those results. But most of the videos online, the answers are really short and they're not really breaking down every specific component that you need for a great answer. That's what I'm going to do in today's video. We're going to do a screen share, and I am going to help you absolutely crush your behavioral answer. You will never need to watch another behavioral video ever again, except for maybe some of the cards and other content I'm going to throw up there. Let's get right into it. Let's go into our screen share. So what's our starting point? Our starting point is that we are going to title your example. So with titling your example, this is something that we're going to utilize on the cheat sheet. I'll throw a card up above so you can see how to take advantage of titling your answers, but just some basic generic title, Salesforce initiative, etc. You're going to know because it happened to you. So let's dive into the situation and task. One of the critical mistakes in the very beginning of your answer is establishing credibility. So, how do we establish credibility? We state our role and company in any pertinent details. What does that mean? It means that if your role and or company needs a little bit of explanation, like it's not very clear, you're going to want to give a little bit of that context. And then if you have another behavioral answer during the interview, you're not going to need to provide that context again, but you will want to state your role and company. Again, it's credibility. You're likely in the interview because you've been in a like or similar role, so we're establishing that right in the beginning. Then we move on to detailing relevant people, processes, technologies, and the challenge at hand. And so much of that is taking our time after we get the interview question to think about it, write it down, restate it, and then ask ourselves, how are we really answering the question? And this is where the vast majority of people fall down. This is where they get into a really long story, start telling me a lot of details that are not pertinent. They don't matter. So when you write down your relevant details, think 2 to 3 sentences and speak at a 5th, 6th, or 7th grade level. What does that mean? No abbreviations, use common language. That's where you're going to have success. And then lastly, if there's any specific responsibility you had to drive the technical component, you had to drive the business component, and then a timeline. Why establish a timeline? Because they don't know if it took you a day or a year. And sometimes just that general context will be so helpful. You should be able to do all this in about 30 seconds. Now, I have this document available at practiceinterviews.com, and I will put a reference to that link down below, but this is where you'd want to fill in each one of these items. Remember, we're building a system for these great answers. Then let's go ahead and move on to our actions. So almost always, almost every single example is going to start by us talking about how we looked at data, did some initial research, some planning, and chatted with people. This is almost always where we start, and it's foundational. So as you're going through this, you're going to find that in your behavioral answers, this is always our starting point. So why build it this way? So what is this line, and then what are these lines? This is your what. What exactly did you do? And then these will be the supporting actions, otherwise known as your hows. So what did you do and how did you do it? This part of the actions is where most people have success. This is where most people spend all their time. But what's the bigger challenge? It's that we spend a lot of time here, but then as we move on to these steps, execution and testing, presenting, launching, and documenting, and I'll go back up, that's where we don't spend a lot of time. So we want to really get into what was that initial item or thing that we did from a data research and conversation perspective, but then how did we execute on that item? How did we test that item? Those are going to be the absolutely critical next steps, because execution is a really good way to show that past performance predicts future performance. If you're not getting into the what you did here and how you did it, it's really going to be a struggle for your interviewer to understand how your past performance predicts future performance. Then at the end, just want to again scroll down here. We're going to present, launch, and document. Usually there's some sort of presentation. We're launching maybe a product, a feature, and then we're documenting it for the greater good of the organization. So when you do that, you're just going to want to make sure that that is your last action, because that's usually how we round things out. I really want you to double down and focus in on what's and how's. What did you do and how did you do it? Because if you focus just on those concepts, you're going to get away from storytelling. A little bit of storytelling is okay, but too much is really going to weigh your interviewer down and they're not going to know what you did. 2 minutes is really the minimum. I would say 2 to 3 minutes on this section. Results. What's really interesting in the results section is that oftentimes candidates will actually skip this section. They'll say, and everything went great, or they'll say, and that's what I did, but they won't get into the results section. And results are absolutely key, because this is typically where we're going to end our answer. We're going to get into some optional items here in a minute, but with results, your first result should actually answer the question. And surprisingly, this happens rarely. So if it's a question about a conflict with Jane, we just say, and the best result was that Jane and I not only had a great relationship moving forward, but we were collaborating on a number of critical items to help the business have success. Then you're going to want to start to quantify and qualify. What does that mean exactly? We start to bring in numbers. We start to bring in relevant data that our interviewer will truly understand. Remember the criticality of speaking in a common language, common speak, whatever we want to call it. Numbers really allow your interviewer to understand the results. And remember, you're not always going to have numbers, but if you can bring them in, that's going to be important. And then this repeatability piece. I really want to make sure that you think about the bigger win. So sometimes we build a process for our group, our team, but that process is shared with the larger organization, and then it's repeated by other colleagues, other stakeholders throughout the organization. Do not forget to end with what was the biggest win. This is going to be absolutely critical, and you will see a positive reaction in your interviewer's body language when you're constantly talking about this repeatability at the end. Let's move on to learnings and follow-up questions. These are both what I would call optional. These are optional items, and I actually want to go back. I just want your results to fall in that 30-second time frame. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. Now with learnings and follow-up questions, these can be really impactful if they're done well. If they're not done well, they can actually pull down your answer and make your answer less relevant, not as strong as you would like. So if you are going to make a learning or implement a learning, make sure it's impactful and memorable, and make sure that the learning is specific to the situation. Don't start to take me down a path of a random learning. And then what I do find is when my clients and when candidates add in learnings, usually there's too much information. So really focus in on one key learning that was relevant to the question that was asked of you. And if you bring it in, just make sure it's powerful and impactful, because that repeatability result is already a very impactful way to end your answer. So the learning should add more value. Just ask yourself, is this adding more value? If it's not adding more value, it's probably not going to really help you. And that's why 15 seconds. I want you to be super succinct. It's got to be very clear, very clean. Just write out a 1-sentence learning, and usually that's going to be enough to bring in some impact. Now, follow-up questions. Let's end here. Do I love follow-up questions at the end of a behavioral question? Sometimes these are best to use when we have really, really robust answers. Like it's a 2-year initiative and we just can't get into the weeds and all of our actions to answer the question. Then we would use specific questions to expand on what we talked about. So let's go back for a second. If we go back here to our actions, we would ask specific questions in these categories. Can I tell you a little bit more about that data we researched initially to get to the testing and execution phase. When we were going through that infrastructure initiative, I wasn't able to touch on A, B, or C. Would you like me to expand on those items? I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the launch and some of the additional details that I didn't want to go into too much depth in my initial answer. So again, you're going to try and keep this around 15 seconds, but the challenge I see with most candidates and most of my clients is when they expand on their follow-up questions or ask follow-up questions, they're very general. We always want to ask specific follow-up questions because that's going to be the best opportunity for our interviewer to want to engage more and hear more. And the more we're talking, the more they're interested, the better the result would be. I really hope this helps. Use this document. The biggest challenge I see online is that there's no system or process in place for answering behavioral questions, and this will really help you have success.